You know, when we hear about the Roman Empire, majestic aqueducts, legions in shining armor, and gladiators in the arenas of the Colosseum immediately come to mind. We imagine the power of military campaigns, the iron discipline of the legionaries, the art of Roman engineers who knew how to build roads and bridges to last for centuries. And this is all true. Rome was indeed an invincible war machine that subjugated the entire known world at the time. But today, I want to tell you about something else, something that was hidden behind this outward strength, about the foundation upon which this entire grandiose empire actually stood. Because Rome was built not only of stone and steel, its true basis was much subtler and simultaneously stronger. It was philosophy. Imagine this. It was the 2nd century BCE. Roman legions had just conquered Greece, that astonishing world of ancient city-states where democracy, theater, and the Olympic Games were born. And along with the military victory, the Romans received something unexpected. They encountered Greek culture, which, in its depth and refinement, surpassed everything they had known before. And the most valuable treasure of this culture was neither gold nor works of art, but philosophy, the art of reflecting on the most important things, the meaning of life, good and evil, and how to live rightly and die with dignity. Romans were practical people. They did not like dwelling in the clouds of abstract reasoning. Unlike the Greeks, who could argue for hours about the nature of being and the ideal forms of things, the Romans viewed philosophy as a tool. They needed not beautiful theories, but practical answers to simple questions. How should I live this life? How do I remain a decent person when blood is flowing all around? How do I govern a vast empire justly? How do I face death without losing face? And this is where something astonishing happened. The Romans took Greek philosophy and refined it in their own furnace, creating something completely new. They cast aside all the superfluous elements, all the metaphysics and abstractions, and kept only the essence, ethics, the doctrine of how to live. Greek philosophy pondered the cosmos and the nature of things, while Roman philosophy pondered duty, dignity, and correct conduct. The Greeks created theories. The Romans built their lives upon these theories. Imagine a young Roman from a noble family. Since childhood, he is surrounded by Greek philosopher teachers who live in his house and tell him daily about the great thinkers of the past. He hears about Plato, who taught about a just state where the wise rule. He learns about Aristotle, who spoke of the golden mean, and that virtue is the ability to find equilibrium between extremes. And all these ideas settle in his consciousness, shaping his view of the world, of himself, and of his duty to the state. It was precisely from such young people that those who created Roman law, the greatest achievement of antique civilization, later grew. Because Roman law was not merely a collection of statutes, it was philosophy in practice. Every legal norm rested on profound philosophical principles, on the idea of natural law, which is superior to any human establishment, on the concept of justice, and on the notion that all people are, in some sense, equal before reason and nature. For many centuries, from the very times when Greek wisdom first penetrated Rome, until the empire's twilight when the last philosophical schools closed their doors, philosophy remained the living, pulsating heart of Roman civilization. It was not a scholarly science, nor an amusement for idle minds. It was a guide to action, a compass in the sea of life's storms. And which philosophical currents proved especially close to the Roman spirit? There were several, each with its own character and message. Stoicism taught how to maintain dignity in any circumstance, to master oneself, and to fulfill one's duty without complaining about fate. Epicureanism proposed seeking happiness in simple pleasures and freedom from fears. Skepticism reminded us that truth is elusive, and one must maintain a critical mind. Platonism and its later offspring, Neoplatonism, called upwards towards the world of ideas and divine light. And all these teachings, each in its own way, formed the consciousness of the Romans. But the most important thing is this: philosophy was not an abstract theory for the Romans, divorced from life. It was embodied in specific people, in their destinies, in their choices. And now I will tell you about those who made philosophy not just a subject of contemplation, but a way of life. About the great Cicero, who created the very Latin philosophical discourse and who died defending the Republic. About Seneca, who was the wealthiest man in Rome, yet taught contempt for wealth, and who embraced death with incredible dignity. About Epictetus, who was a slave and became a sage, whose words still inspire millions. About Marcus Aurelius, who wore the imperial crown and every evening in his campaign tent, amidst war and bloodshed, recorded philosophical reflections on the transience of all things. These are not just names from history textbooks. They are living people who demonstrated what it means to live by philosophical principles. Each of them faced incredible trials: tyranny, wars, betrayal, the inevitability of death. And each of them found the strength in philosophy to remain human. The history of the Roman Empire lasted many centuries, from the time when Roman legions first began their victorious march across the Mediterranean until that sad era when the empire crumbled under the pressure of barbarian tribes. And throughout all that time, philosophy was the invisible core that sustained Roman civilization. It taught generals to be merciful in victory, judges to be fair in their verdicts, and ordinary citizens to be dignified in everyday life. The Romans understood something very important. One can conquer the world by force of arms, but one can only hold it by the power of ideas. One can build majestic buildings, but without a strong spiritual foundation, they will eventually turn to ruins. And that foundation for them became philosophy, not as an abstract science, but as the living art of living rightly. In the following chapters, we will journey through centuries of Roman history, from the first encounters with Greek wisdom to the last flashes of antique thought. We will see how philosophical ideas shaped the character of an entire civilization, how they were embodied in laws and customs, in the actions of heroes and martyrs. We will become acquainted with great doctrines and great teachers, each of whom added his stroke to the grand picture of Roman philosophical thought. And perhaps, in these ancient wisdoms, we will find something important for ourselves. Because the questions that Roman philosophers ask themselves are eternal questions. How do we live with dignity? How do we preserve internal freedom when external circumstances are against us? How do we face the inevitable with our heads held high? These questions sound just as relevant today as 2,000 years ago. So, let us begin this journey through the world of Roman philosophical thought, a world that was simultaneously stern and beautiful, full of tragedies and grandeur, a world that taught humanity to think about what is most important. Imagine the 2nd century BCE. Rome is no longer a small city-state on the hills of Italy. It is a rising power whose legions are spreading throughout the Mediterranean. And now comes the moment when Roman soldiers enter the ancient Greek cities, Athens, Corinth, and other great poleis, where the greatest minds of humanity had lived and worked for centuries. This was a strange victory. The Romans conquered Greece with the sword, but they themselves were conquered by Greek culture. They came as victors, but quickly realized that they were facing a civilization that was spiritually superior to their own. The Greeks knew how to do what the Romans did not. They knew how to think about the deepest things. They created philosophy, poetry, dramaturgy, and science. And the Romans, being practical and intelligent people, did not reject this treasure. On the contrary, they began to eagerly absorb Greek wisdom. During those times, a stream of Greek captives flooded into Rome, among whom were many educated people, philosophers, teachers, rhetoricians. The Roman aristocracy quickly grasped the value of Greek education. It became fashionable and prestigious to have a Greek tutor in one's home who would oversee the children's upbringing. These Greeks lived in Roman homes in a special position. They were slaves or freedmen in status, but teachers and mentors in essence. They read Homer to their students, told them about Plato and Aristotle, and taught them the Greek language, which became a second native tongue for the educated Roman. Young Romans from noble families grew up listening to Greek truths, and two figures stood above all others in the pantheon of Greek thought, Plato and Aristotle. These two philosophers laid the foundation upon which all subsequent European philosophy was built. Plato. His name is surrounded by a special light in the history of thought. This Athenian, who lived in the 4th century BCE, was a student of Socrates himself, that sage who chose to drink poison rather than betray his principles. After his teacher's execution, Plato was shaken. He saw how democratic Athens, which he loved, killed the best of men. And Plato asked himself the question, can a just state exist at all? Is it possible to build a society where not the mob or tyrants rule, but wisdom and reason? Thus was born his doctrine of the ideal state. Plato wrote a dialogue which is called The Republic, and in it he attempted to outline a model of a perfect societal structure. The foundation of this ideal state is justice. But what is justice? For Plato, justice is when everyone attends to their own business, to what they are naturally intended for. Plato divided people in his ideal state into three classes. There are those in whom the rational principle prevails. These are the philosophers, the sages, who must rule. There are those in whom the spirited, volitional principle is strong. These are the warriors, the guardians, who protect the state. And there are those who live by desires and engage in economy. These are the farmers, the artisans, the traders. Each class performs its function, and when everyone is in their place, that is when justice reigns. But the most important thing in Plato's doctrine is his idea that philosophers should rule. Only those who have attained wisdom, who see the truth, who understand what the good is, only they have the right to hold power. This was a revolutionary idea. Plato said, "A state will only be happy when philosophers become kings, or when kings become philosophers." The Romans were deeply moved by this idea. They were statesmen to the core. Issues of power and governance concerned them no less than military campaigns. And although the Romans never attempted to literally implement the Platonic project, it was too utopian, too detached from reality. The very thought that the best, the most worthy, should rule penetrated their consciousness. Along with this, the Romans also heard another of Plato's teachings, his theory of forms, ideas. Plato taught that the visible world is merely a shadow of the true world. There is a world of ideas, a world of eternal and perfect paradigms, and our world is only a pale copy of these paradigms. There is the idea of justice, eternal, unchanging, perfect. And there are our human attempts to be just, imperfect, changing, often erroneous. For the Romans, who were creating law, this idea proved incredibly fruitful. They began to search for the eternal principles that should underpin laws, not just rules that change from case to case, but something unshakable that originates from the very nature of things. Thus was born the idea of natural law, the law that exists independently of human establishments. But if Plato called upwards, to the world of ideas, his student Aristotle stood firmly on the ground. Aristotle was a completely different philosopher. He was born in the 4th century BCE in Macedonia, studied under Plato in Athens, and later became the tutor of the young Alexander, the very man who would later conquer half the world. Aristotle was a scientist in the modern sense of the word. He studied nature, animals, plants, and weather. He collected facts, classified, and analyzed. And Aristotle's philosophy was the philosophy of reality, not of the otherworldly realm of ideas. He taught that one should study not abstract paradigms, but real life. And when Aristotle turned to ethical questions, the question of how to live rightly, he created a doctrine that the Romans embraced wholeheartedly. Aristotle spoke of virtue. What is virtue? It is the ability to find the correct middle ground between extremes. Imagine this. There is cowardice. That is one vice, and there is reckless bravery. That is another vice. And in the middle between them lies courage, true virtue. Or take generosity. It lies between stinginess and extravagance, moderation, between asceticism and debauchery. This doctrine of the golden mean suited the Romans perfectly. They generally valued moderation, measure in all things. They even had a saying, nothing in excess. Roman virtue is not an extreme, not fanaticism, but a rational equilibrium. And Aristotle gave them the philosophical justification for this intuition. Aristotle taught another important thing. Virtue is not a gift from the gods that a person is endowed with from birth. Virtue can be learned. A person becomes virtuous through practice, through the habit of acting rightly. It is like a musical instrument. No one is born a pianist. One becomes a pianist by practicing every day. It is the same with virtue. One becomes just by performing just acts, courageous by performing courageous acts. This idea formed the basis of Roman education. The Romans understood that character must be shaped, that valor is the result of persistent self-work. But Aristotle gave the Romans not only ethics, he gave them logic, the art of correct reasoning. Aristotle created the system of syllogisms, taught how to construct proofs, how to distinguish true from false, and how to build argumentation. And this became the foundation for the two fields in which the Romans achieved the highest mastery, jurisprudence and oratory. A Roman judge or lawyer had to be able to construct their speech logically, flawlessly, prove the righteousness of their cause, and find weaknesses in the opponent's arguments. And here, Aristotelian logic was an indispensable tool. Similarly, when creating laws, strict logic was needed to avoid contradictions, to deduce private norms from general principles. The Romans took philosophy from the Greeks, but they refined it, changed it, and adapted it to their needs. The Greeks loved to reason for the sake of reasoning itself. They could argue for hours about abstract matters. The Romans were not interested in this. They asked, what is the practical benefit of this? How will this help me live? How will this help govern the state? And therefore, from all the richness of Greek philosophy, the Romans took primarily ethics and political philosophy, that which directly concerns the life of man and society. Metaphysical subtleties, arguments about the nature of being and cognition, all this faded into the background. Philosophy became a practical guide for the Romans. At the same time, the Romans faced a problem. Greek philosophical concepts did not have exact equivalents in the Latin language, and so Roman thinkers had to create Latin philosophical terminology. They took Greek terms and either translated them into Latin, selecting words close in meaning, or simply borrowed them, giving them a Latin form. Cicero, the great orator and philosopher, whom we will discuss in detail later, did particularly much in this work. It was Cicero who created many Latin philosophical terms that later, via Latin, entered all European languages. Thanks to this, Greek wisdom found a new life. It began to speak Latin, and through Latin, it reached all corners of the vast empire. Thus, Greek philosophy, Plato's thoughts on the ideal state and the eternal principles of justice, Aristotle's doctrine of the golden mean and logical reasoning, penetrated the Roman consciousness and became part of Roman culture. Roman youths from noble families grew up absorbing these ideas with the milk of Greek tutors. And when they grew up and took high positions in the state, they carried this philosophical baggage with them. But this was only the beginning. Greek philosophy gave the Romans language, concepts, and a general framework for thinking. But the true uniqueness of Roman philosophical thought would emerge later when the Romans began to develop the doctrines that most closely matched their own spirit. And above all, Stoicism, the philosophy of duty, dignity, and inner freedom. Among all the philosophical doctrines that the Romans borrowed from the Greeks, one became truly native to them. This was Stoicism, a philosophy that seemed to be specially created for the Roman character, for the Roman spirit. The history of Stoicism began in Athens at the turn of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, at a time when the old world of Greek city-states was collapsing under the onslaught of Macedonian kings, when Alexander the Great was creating his vast empire, and after his death, this empire was breaking apart into pieces in bloody wars. This was an era of upheaval, when man lost his footing, when old values crumbled, and the future seemed unpredictable. And so, during these difficult times, a young man arrived in Athens from distant Citium, a city on the island of Cyprus. His name was Zeno, and by origin he was a Phoenician, a descendant of those very Phoenicians who were the great seafarers of antiquity. Zeno came to Athens on business. His family was engaged in commerce, but fate decided otherwise. He became fascinated with philosophy, started attending lectures by various teachers, and eventually decided to dedicate himself to the search for wisdom. Zeno was an unusual man. He lived very simply, without luxury, without a family, without slaves, yet he did not fall into an extreme, as the Cynics did, who deliberately lived in poverty and filth to show their contempt for society's conventions. Zeno found his middle ground. He was poor but dignified, modest but not wretched. Sometime around 300 BCE, Zeno himself began teaching philosophy. He could not afford to rent premises for a school, so he gathered his students in a public place, in one of the covered colonnades in the Athenian marketplace, which was called the Painted Stoa, because its walls were adorned with frescoes depicting the Battle of Marathon. In Greek, the word stoa simply means a portico, a covered gallery with columns. And it was from this place that Zeno's school got its name, Stoics, that is, those who study in the Stoa. Interestingly, in the Russian language, a coincidental yet very precise play on words occurred. The Greek stoa has nothing to do with stoikos, fortitude or resilience, but Stoicism indeed taught exactly that, fortitude of spirit. And so it happened that the name of the philosophy accidentally coincided with its essence. Zeno lived in Athens for many years and enjoyed immense respect. The Athenians honored him with a golden crown and erected a statue, and when he died in deep old age, they buried him with honors. It is said that he ended his life by suicide, intentionally holding his breath. Stoics considered suicide permissible if life became impossible or meaningless. So, what was the doctrine Zeno created that the Romans later loved so much? What was its essence? The Stoics taught that the world is a single whole, a living organism permeated by divine reason. They called this reason by the Greek word logos. Logos is not a personal god, not someone who lives somewhere in the heavens. Logos is the very law of the universe, the rational order that governs all existence. It is in everything, in the movement of the stars, in the change of seasons, in the growth of plants, in the actions of humans. The entire cosmos is rational because it is all permeated by the Logos. Man also carries a particle of this divine Logos. It is his own reason. And here is the key to all Stoic ethics. To live rightly means to live in agreement with nature, in agreement with the Logos, in agreement with reason. Not to resist the course of things, not to rebel against the inevitable, but to accept one's fate and fulfill one's destiny with dignity. The Stoics were determinists. They believed that everything in the world happens out of necessity, that every person's fate is predetermined. But this did not make man a spiritless puppet, because although we cannot change what happens to us, we can always choose how to react to it. External circumstances are not within our power, but our thoughts, our judgments, our inner state. That depends only on us. And the Stoics drew a very clear line. On one side, that which is within our power, our opinions, our desires, our aspirations, our choice of how to react to events. On the other side, that which is not within our power, our body, our property, our reputation, our social standing, and even life itself. And everything that is not within our power, the Stoic must treat with indifference. This does not mean that the Stoic does not value health or wealth. He understands that they can be useful, but he does not consider them to be the genuine good. There is only one genuine good, virtue, which is the correct state of the soul, wisdom, justice, courage, moderation, and everything else, health, wealth, fame, even life, all of this is indifferent from the perspective of happiness. One can be happy in wealth or in poverty, in health or in sickness, and even under torture, if one's soul preserves virtue. Imagine what a powerful doctrine this was. It gave man incredible inner freedom. You can lose everything, property, position, health, life itself, but if you preserve virtue, if you remain true to reason, you will remain free and happy. No tyrant can take away the main thing from you, your dignity, your inner honesty. Now it is clear why the Romans liked this teaching so much. Romans were people of duty. For them, service to the state was the highest value. A Roman citizen had to be ready to sacrifice everything for the homeland, wealth, comfort, even life. And Stoicism provided the philosophical justification for this readiness for sacrifice. If virtue is the only good, then fulfilling one's duty is more important than preserving one's life. The Romans valued discipline, self-control, and the ability to master themselves. A good Roman should not show emotions. He should be firm as a rock, unyielding in the face of any trial. And Stoicism taught exactly this: control over emotions, the subordination of passions to reason. The Romans were practical people. They did not like abstract reasoning. And Stoicism was a practical philosophy. It gave concrete instructions on how to live, how to act in different situations. It was not a theory for contemplation, but a guide to action. But Stoicism gave the Romans one more important idea, the idea of cosmopolitanism. The Stoics taught that all people are citizens of a single world state. Because all people carry a spark of the divine Logos within them, they are all rational beings, and therefore they are all brothers. The boundaries between peoples, the distinctions between Greeks and barbarians, between free people and slaves, all this is conditional from the perspective of higher truth. This idea was incredibly consonant with Roman imperial ideology. Rome was creating a world power, uniting dozens of peoples under its rule. and Stoic cosmopolitanism provided the moral justification for this expansion. The Romans brought the world not just their domination, they brought a single law, a unified order. They united humanity into one family. And here we come to one of the most important contributions of Stoicism to Roman civilization, the idea of natural law. The Stoics taught that there is a law that is superior to any human laws. This is the law that flows from the very nature of things, from the divine logos. It is uniform for all people, for all nations, for all times. Roman jurists, many of whom were educated in Stoic philosophy, adopted this idea. They began to distinguish between natural law, that which is just by nature itself, and positive law, that which is established by humans. And the criterion for the correctness of human laws became their correspondence to natural law. A law that contradicts nature, that is unjust, has no force. This idea was revolutionary. It meant that there was a limit to the arbitrariness of power, that not everything commanded by law or the emperor constitutes right. There is a higher authority, reason, nature, justice, and one can appeal to this authority. But Stoicism was not only a philosophy for statesmen and jurists. It was a philosophy for everyone who faced the difficulties of life. And these difficulties, especially in the late Roman Republic and the early Empire, were terrible. It was a time of civil wars, of proscriptions, when lists of the undesirable were posted in the forums, and anyone could be killed and their property confiscated. It was a time of imperial tyranny, when your life depended on the whim of a single person. In such times, Stoicism became a philosophy of survival. It taught how to maintain dignity when everything around was collapsing, how to remain human when living under the rule of a tyrant, how to face death, and it could come at any moment, without fear, with one's head held high. The Stoics thought much about death. They taught a practice that could be called daily dying. Every day, upon waking, the Stoic reminded himself, this day might be the last. Every evening, upon falling asleep, he would, as it were, summarize the day lived, asking himself, if I died today, would I be satisfied with my life? This was not morbid self-torture. It was an exercise that helped one value every moment of life and not fear the inevitable end. And when death truly came, and many Roman Stoics were sentenced to execution or forced to commit suicide, they met it with astonishing calmness. For the Stoic, death was not a tragedy, but the natural completion of life, a return to the bosom of nature, a reunification with the universal logos. Fearing death is just as foolish as fearing the sunset or the change of seasons. Stoicism became the philosophy of the Roman elite. The most outstanding minds of Rome, statesmen, generals, writers, jurists, found support and inspiration in it. And now we will become acquainted with specific people who not only professed Stoicism, but lived by its principles, and showed the whole world what it means to be a Stoic. Now that we understand what Stoicism is, it is time to meet the man who made this doctrine come alive, who transformed it from a set of principles into a way of life. A man whose fate was full of paradoxes and contradictions, but who, thanks to these very contradictions, showed how difficult and how necessary philosophy is in real life. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and he was born somewhere around the turn of the eras. The exact date is unknown, approximately in the 4th year BCE, in the distant Spanish province, in the city of Corduba, which today is called Cordoba. His father was a wealthy and educated man, a famous teacher of rhetoric, and bore the same name, Seneca the Elder, and wrote books on the art of oratory. The family belonged to the equestrian order. This was the Roman upper middle class, wealthy people but not aristocrats by blood. Seneca was brought to Rome as a boy, and here he received a brilliant education. He studied rhetoric, philosophy, and became acquainted with the doctrines of different schools. But he was most attracted to Stoicism. In this doctrine, he found what he was looking for: a guide to life, a way to attain inner freedom in a world full of dangers and injustice. Young Seneca began his career. He practiced law, spoke in the courts, and entered politics. But then fate struck the first blow. Under Emperor Claudius, in the 41st year of our era, Seneca was accused of an affair with the emperor's niece and sent into exile to Corsica, a harsh, rocky island where there was no comfort, no society, and no books. This was virtually a sentence of civil death. And here, in exile, far from Rome, from power, from friends, Seneca lived for 8 long years. One can imagine how difficult this was for a man accustomed to an active life and the brilliance of the capital. But it was precisely in this exile that Seneca truly became a Stoic philosopher. He understood firsthand what it means to lose all external things: position, wealth, hopes. And he learned to find support within himself, in his reason, in his virtue. However, fate was preparing a new turn. In the 50th year, Empress Agrippina, an energetic and power-hungry woman, secured Seneca's return from exile. She entrusted him with the education of her 12-year-old son, Nero, whom she was preparing for the throne. Seneca agreed. Perhaps he was motivated by ambition, perhaps by a sincere desire to raise an ideal ruler, a philosopher on the throne who would govern wisely and mercifully. This was the greatest dream of the Stoics: to unite philosophy and power, to create that very philosopher-king about whom Plato wrote. And for several years, Seneca worked with young Nero, instilling in him ideas of justice, moderation, and humanity. When Nero became emperor in the 54th year, he was only 16 years old, Seneca was by his side as the chief advisor. Historians called the first years of Nero's reign a golden age. The young emperor, guided by Seneca, ruled gently, did not shed blood, and listened to the Senate. Seneca even wrote a treatise for him on clemency, where he explained that a true ruler should be like a father to his subjects, strict but just and merciful. But here we encounter the main paradox of Seneca's life. He preached poverty. He taught that a true sage should not pursue wealth. Yet, during these years, he became one of the wealthiest men in Rome. His fortune was estimated at 300 million sesterces, an astronomical sum. He owned villas, gardens, and slaves, and even loaned money to British chieftains. Critics, and Seneca had many, accused him of hypocrisy. How can one speak of contempt for wealth while personally drowning in luxury? How can one teach simplicity while living in marble palaces? But Seneca would have answered this way: wealth in itself is neither evil nor good. It is indifferent. What matters is not how much you have, but how you relate to it. One can be poor and greedy, envious, unhappy, or one can be rich and internally free, not attached to one's wealth, ready to leave everything at any moment. And Seneca was indeed ready. When the time came, and it did come, he let go of everything without regret. The years passed, and Nero changed. The young man who seemed so promising turned into a monster. In the 59th year, he murdered his mother, Agrippina, the woman who gave him the throne, and Seneca was forced to write a defense speech for him before the Senate. It was, perhaps, the most terrible and shameful thing he ever did. After this, their relationship definitively deteriorated. Nero sank deeper into madness and cruelty, and Seneca understood ever more clearly that his dream of a philosopher on the throne had collapsed. In the 62nd year, after the death of his friend, the commander Burrus, Seneca requested retirement. He offered to return all his immense wealth to the emperor, villas, money, everything down to the last coin. Nero formally refused, but effectively let his teacher go. Seneca spent the last 3 years of his life in seclusion, hardly leaving his home. He knew that Nero would not forgive him, that the very person of Seneca, the embodiment of conscience and moral standard, was a constant reproach to the emperor. But Seneca did not flee. He stayed in Rome and waited. During these years, he wrote extensively, and it was then that his greatest works appeared. Moral Letters to Lucilius, 124 letters addressed to a friend, where Seneca discussed everything, life and death, time and eternity, passions and virtues. These letters are written in an astonishing language, simple, warm, and personal. Reading them, one feels that Seneca is talking precisely to you, sharing his thoughts, his doubts, his experience. In one of the first letters, he writes about time, that it is the only true wealth of man. We do not value time, we squander it. We allow others to steal it from us. Yet every hour that has passed already belongs to death. Therefore, we must guard time, use every minute for something important, for reflection, for self-improvement, for helping others. Seneca wrote extensively about death. For the Stoic, reflection on death is not morbid gloom, but a way to live rightly. Every day can be the last. And this thought is not frightening, but liberating. If I know I might die today, I will not postpone what is important until tomorrow. I will not waste time on trifles. I will live a real, full life right now. He who has learned death has unlearned slavery, Seneca wrote. Death is the ultimate freedom. It cannot be taken away. It can only be granted to oneself. And therefore, the Stoics did not fear death. They knew that in the extreme case, they always had an exit. Seneca taught fighting passions, anger, envy, greed, fear. He wrote an entire treatise on anger, where he showed how destructive this emotion is, how it turns a man into a beast. Anger should not be restrained, but eradicated, through the exercises of reason, through constant self-work. Surprisingly, Seneca, who lived in a society where slavery was the norm, wrote about slaves with a humanity that was ahead of his time. He said, "A slave is just as much a man as you. He has the same human nature, the same reason, the same capacity for virtue. Do not despise slaves. Treat them with respect. For in the eyes of fate, we are all equal. Today you are a master, and tomorrow, who knows, you might be a slave." Seneca criticized the cruel amusements of the Romans, gladiatorial combats, where men killed each other for the pleasure of the crowd. He called it an inhuman spectacle, a school of cruelty. In the 65th year, a conspiracy against Nero was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy, in which senators, military men, and poets participated, all those weary of the tyranny. Seneca, most likely, did not participate in the conspiracy. He was already old, ill, and far removed from politics. But Nero could not miss the opportunity to get rid of him. The emperor sent his officer to Seneca with an order: commit suicide, choosing any method. This was a formal mercy. Suicide was considered less disgraceful than execution and allowed property to be saved for the heirs. Seneca accepted the order calmly. He gathered his friends, students, and his wife Paulina around him. He ordered his will to be brought, but the officer did not allow it. Nero forbade it. Then Seneca told his friends, "I leave you the only thing I have, but it is the most valuable, the image of my life." Paulina wanted to die with him. They slit the veins on their arms, and slow bleeding began. But the old man's blood flowed too slowly. Years of asceticism and illness had exhausted his body. Seneca slit the veins on his legs as well. The suffering continued. He asked a doctor friend to administer poison. He gave hemlock, cicuta, the same poison that Socrates drank. But the poison also had no effect. The body was too cold. Then Seneca was carried into a hot bath, hoping that the warmth would hasten the bleeding. He sprinkled water on his slaves and said, "This is a libation to Jupiter the Liberator." And there, in the hot vapors of the bath, he finally died. Paulina, however, was saved in time. Nero, hearing of her intention, ordered the bleeding stopped. She lived for many more years with pale scars on her arms, a memory of that day. Seneca's death shocked his contemporaries. The historian Tacitus described it with admiration. People compared the philosopher to Socrates, the same stoicism in the face of injustice, the same dignity before the inevitable. Seneca's books survived the ages. In the Middle Ages, he was read on par with the Christian Church Fathers. His ethical ideas seemed so close to Christianity. In the Renaissance, when antiquity was rediscovered, Seneca became one of the most beloved authors. He was quoted by Montaigne, Erasmus of Rotterdam, and Calvin. In the modern age, he was read by Descartes, Spinoza, and Rousseau. And today, 2,000 years later, people are still opening his letters to Lucilius and finding answers to eternal questions in them. How to live, how to relate to wealth, how not to fear death, how to preserve oneself in a world that is trying to break you. Seneca was not a perfect man. He made mistakes, made compromises, and served a tyrant. But in the end, he showed what true Stoic virtue is. He met death the way he taught to meet it his entire life, with a clear mind, with dignity, without fear, and without complaint. There is something wonderfully beautiful in how Stoicism united people from completely different worlds. Imagine, on one side, a slave, lame, possessing nothing but a straw mat and a clay lamp. On the other, an emperor, the ruler of the greatest power in the world, a man in whose hands absolute power was concentrated. And both of them are Stoics. Both are seeking the same thing: inner freedom, tranquility of soul, the ability to live with dignity in this complicated world. Let us begin with the one who stood lowest in the social hierarchy of Rome, yet towered above most by the strength of his spirit. Epictetus was born around the 50th year of our era in Phrygia, a region in Asia Minor, in the territory of modern Turkey. His mother was a slave, and he himself was born into the status of a slave. He did not even have a real name. The word Epictetus in Greek simply means acquired, purchased. He was not a person with a name, but an object with a tag. He was bought by a man named Epaphroditus, Emperor Nero's secretary, a wealthy and influential freedman. Epaphroditus was cruel. One day, he was beating his slave so severely that Epictetus calmly told him, "You're going to break my leg." The master continued to beat him, and when the leg actually broke, Epictetus only added, "I warned you." After that, he remained lame for life. But in this episode, the entire essence of the future philosopher is already visible: calmness in the face of what is not within your power to change. But this story has a bright side. Epaphroditus liked to attend philosophical lectures. It was fashionable among the Roman elite. He listened to the famous Stoic Musonius Rufus, and Epictetus accompanied his master to these sessions. And there, standing somewhere in the corner, this nameless slave listened about how all people are equal before reason, that true freedom does not depend on external circumstances, and that one can be a slave in body, but free in spirit. Can you imagine how those words sounded to a man in his position? It was not abstract philosophy. It was a guide to survival, to preserving human dignity in inhuman conditions. When Emperor Nero died and the chaos of civil war followed, Epaphroditus was executed by the new Emperor Domitian. This happened around the 68th year, and Epictetus gained freedom, not because his master showed mercy, but because the master was no more. The free Epictetus remained in Rome, continued to study philosophy, and perhaps even began to teach. But in the 94th year, Emperor Domitian, paranoid about conspiracies, exiled all philosophers from Rome. Philosophy seemed dangerous to the emperor. It taught people to think for themselves, and that was suspicious. Epictetus went to Greece and settled in the city of Nicopolis in Epirus. It was a remote provincial place, far from the large cities, and there he founded his philosophical school. He lived incredibly simply. His possessions consisted of a straw mat, a wooden bench, and a clay lamp. It is said that once his lamp, his only possession, was stolen, and the next day he bought an even simpler and cheaper clay lamp, saying, "Tomorrow I will have a lamp that no one will want to steal." Epictetus never wrote anything down. He taught the way his beloved hero Socrates taught, through conversations, through living dialogue with students. But among his listeners was one remarkable person, a young Roman senator named Flavius Arrian. Arrian was so impressed with his teacher that he wrote down his lectures word for word, trying to preserve even the intonation, even the manner of speech. Thanks to Arrian, Epictetus's discourses reached us, 4 books out of the 8 he recorded, as well as the short Enchiridion manual, an essence of the teacher's most important thoughts. And when you read these texts, you feel as if you hear the voice of Epictetus himself, simple, direct, without any pretension, full of practical advice and vivid examples. What was the essence of his teaching? It all begins with one simple distinction. Epictetus taught, there are things that are within our power, and there are things that are not within our power. And a person's happiness depends on how clearly he understands this difference. What is within our power? Our opinions, our desires, our aspirations, our judgments about what is happening. In a word, everything that happens in our soul. And what is not within our power? Everything else. Our body, our property, our reputation, our social standing, the opinions of others about us, and even life itself. Epictetus said, "Who among men is invincible? He who is concerned with nothing that is outside of his own choice." Imagine what a powerful thought this is. No one can harm you if you do not consider what they can do to be harm. You can be robbed, but that only concerns external things that do not truly belong to you anyway. You can be insulted, but that only concerns your reputation, which depends on the opinions of others, not on your inner essence. You can be killed, but death is inevitable for everyone, and fearing the inevitable is meaningless. True freedom for Epictetus is not the absence of external constraints, but internal independence from everything external. A slave can be freer than an emperor if the former masters himself, while the latter is a slave to his passions, his desires, his fear. Epictetus himself was living proof of this. He lived a long life. He died around the 138th year in deep old age. An epitaph was carved on his grave. Epictetus the slave, lame and poor, like Iris, friend of the immortals. Iris is the beggar from Homer's Odyssey, a symbol of extreme poverty. But this poor slave was a friend of the immortals, that is, the gods, that is, eternal truths. And now, let us move forward by several decades and ascend to the very summit of the Roman world, to the imperial throne. Marcus Aurelius was born in the 121st year into a noble family, in the very heart of the Roman aristocracy. He was noticed by Emperor Hadrian and later adopted by the next emperor, Antoninus Pius. From childhood, Marcus was prepared for power. He received the best education, studied rhetoric and philosophy, and turned to Stoicism already in his youth. In the 161st year, when he was 40 years old, Marcus Aurelius became emperor, the ruler of the greatest empire, which stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. He ruled for almost 20 years, until the 180th year. And these years were incredibly difficult. The empire was in crisis. Barbarians raged on the borders. Germanic tribes broke through the Danube. Parthians threatened from the east. Inside, a plague epidemic wiped out entire provinces. The economy was strained, old virtues were fading, and morals were coarsening. Marcus Aurelius spent most of his reign on military campaigns, in the dirt and blood of border wars, far from the comfort of palaces. And so, in his campaign tent, after long days of battles, negotiations, dealing with complaints and court cases, the emperor would take a wax tablet or a sheet of papyrus and write. He wrote in Greek. For the educated Roman, Greek was the language of philosophy. He wrote for himself, not for publication. He simply recorded his thoughts, his reflections, his attempts to understand this world and his place in it. He called these records very simply, "To Myself." We know them under the title Meditations, and it is one of the greatest texts of human wisdom. 12 books of philosophical notes, written by a man at the pinnacle of power who tried to remain a Stoic philosopher in impossible conditions. You open Meditations, and the first thing that strikes you is the constant reminder of death, of the transience of all existence. Marcus Aurelius returns to this theme again and again. Everything passes, everything disappears, everything is forgotten. Where are the great emperors of the past? What remains of the sages of antiquity? The mighty kingdoms, they have crumbled into dust, and you yourself will soon die, and everything you did will be forgotten. This is not depression. It is the practice of memento mori, remember death. For the Stoic, the constant remembrance of death is a way to live rightly. If you remember that time is limited, you will not waste it on trifles. If you remember the transience of fame, you will not chase it as something important. If you remember that you will die anyway, it is easier to let go of what is not in your power to hold on to. Marcus Aurelius writes to himself, "You can depart from life at any moment. Having this in mind, perform every action, pronounce every word, think every thought. Every day is possibly the last. Live it with dignity." And here is the paradox. The man who possessed absolute power wrote about how little power means. The emperor, surrounded by luxury, reminded himself of simplicity. The ruler, surrounded by crowds of flatterers, constantly reminded himself not to believe praise and not to take offense at criticism, because both are merely the opinions of other people, and they are not within his power. He fulfilled his duty as emperor. He waged wars, judged, governed, not because he wanted power, but because it was his role, his function in the world order. A Stoic accepts his fate. If fate made you emperor, be a good emperor. If it made you a slave, be a dignified slave. What matters is not the position, but how you fulfill it. Meditations is full of amazing humanity. Marcus Aurelius was not a cold Stoic ascetic. He got tired, irritated, and doubted. And he wrote about how to cope with this, how to force yourself to get up in the morning and go do your work, even when you do not want to, how not to get angry at the foolish and ungrateful people you have to tolerate, how to remain calm when everything goes wrong. The Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius is not the triumphant philosophy of a winner. It is the philosophy of a tired man who is holding on with his last strength, but holding on with dignity. It is an answer to crisis, personal and societal. The empire was collapsing, the old world was fading, and philosophy provided support to those who tried to maintain humanity in inhuman times. Marcus Aurelius died in the 180th year on a military campaign on the banks of the Danube, never seeing the end of the war. He was succeeded by his son Commodus, a man who embodied all the worst qualities his father tried to guard himself against through philosophical exercises. This was a tragic irony of fate. But meditations remained, and 2,000 years later, people are still reading the notes of the tired emperor and finding in them consolation, wisdom, and the strength to continue living with dignity, despite everything. We spoke about Stoicism, the philosophy of duty, discipline, and self-denial, about the need to master oneself, control emotions, and be ready for any trials. This was a harsh, demanding, ascetic philosophy. But another doctrine lived in Rome, completely different in spirit, a philosophy that spoke not of duty, but of happiness, not of self-denial, but of enjoying life. This was Epicureanism, and the Romans met it with suspicion and curiosity simultaneously. The founder of this doctrine lived long before Rome became a great power. Epicurus was born in the 341st year BCE on the island of Samos, into a family of Athenian colonists. He grew up in a difficult time. It was the era after the death of Alexander the Great, when the old Greek world was collapsing and the new one had not yet been born. The young Epicurus studied philosophy with various teachers and then decided to establish his own school. Around 300 BCE, he bought a house with a garden in Athens and founded his philosophical community there. The school was called the Garden, or the Garden of Epicurus. It was an unusual place. Unlike other philosophical schools, which only admitted free male citizens, everyone could study in the garden, women, slaves, and foreigners. There was no strict hierarchy. They lived as a community of friends, contemplated together, ate simple food together, and together sought the path to happiness. Above the entrance to the garden, it is said, hung an inscription, "Stranger, you will do well to tarry here. Here, pleasure, the highest good." And many, reading this inscription, thought, here it is, the philosophy of debauchery, a school that teaches indulging in pleasures. But upon entering, one saw something completely different. The Epicureans lived incredibly simply. Their food consisted of bread, water, sometimes a little cheese or vegetables. It was considered a feast if a pot of beans was added to the usual meal. They did not drink wine, did not host lavish feasts, and did not chase luxury. They spent their time in conversation, contemplation, and friendly communication. What then constituted this pleasure that Epicurus proclaimed the highest good? Epicurus taught that happiness is the absence of suffering. In Greek, this was called by the beautiful word ataraxia, serenity, tranquility of spirit, freedom from anxiety. When the body does not ache and the soul is not troubled, that is true pleasure. Epicurus distinguished between different types of pleasures. There are pleasures that are natural and necessary, to satisfy hunger, to quench thirst, to warm oneself. These are easily satisfied, and nature requires only this of us. There are pleasures that are natural but not necessary, tasty food instead of simple food, beautiful clothing instead of coarse clothing. They are pleasant, but one can do without them. And there are pleasures that are unnatural and unnecessary. The thirst for wealth, the pursuit of fame, the desire for power. It is these that bring endless suffering to man, because they are impossible to satisfy. The sage, according to Epicurus, is content with little. The more modest your needs, the easier they are to satisfy. The less you depend on circumstances, the freer you are. Wealth is not having much, but needing little. But the main thing, Epicurus wanted to free people from fear. He saw that people are unhappy not so much because of real suffering, but because of fears. Fear of the gods who might punish, and fear of death. And Epicurus created a philosophical system that was intended to destroy these fears. He developed an entire doctrine about the nature of the world, physics, as it was called. And at the heart of this physics lay the idea borrowed from the ancient philosopher Democritus, the idea of atoms. The entire world, Epicurus taught, consists of tiny, indivisible particles, atoms, and the void in which these atoms move. There is no divine plan, no purpose in the structure of the world. Everything happens by itself, as a result of the accidental collisions and combinations of atoms. Worlds arise, exist for some time, and then break apart, and their atoms form new worlds. The human soul also consists of atoms, only very fine, mobile ones. When the body dies, the atoms of the soul scatter, and the person ceases to exist. There is no afterlife, no judgment of the gods, no punishment for sins. And here Epicurus utters his famous words, which have been repeated for centuries. Death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not yet present, and when death strikes, we no longer exist. Why fear that which you will never meet? While you are alive, death does not exist for you, and when it comes, you will no longer be there to experience it. And the gods? Epicurus did not deny the existence of the gods. That would have been dangerous, and his philosophy allowed for their existence. But Epicurus's gods are nothing like those revered in the temples. The Epicurean gods live somewhere in the intervals between worlds, in perfect bliss and tranquility. They are so happy that they have no concern for people. They do not interfere in the life of the world. They neither punish nor reward. There is no need to fear them, no need to offer them sacrifices in hope of mercy or out of fear of wrath. This was an incredibly liberating doctrine. Imagine, no need to fear death, no need to fear the gods. The two main sources of human anxiety simply disappeared. Only one thing remained, to live here and now in this single life you have, and to arrange it so that it is calm and pleasant. Epicurus taught withdrawing from public life. His famous motto was, "Live unnoticed." Do not strive for power. Do not chase fame. Do not participate in political battles. All of this brings only anxiety and danger. It is better to step aside, live quietly among friends, and enjoy simple pleasures, conversation, contemplation, friendly fellowship. Friendship was the highest value for Epicurus. He said that friendship is the greatest of all goods that wisdom grants for a happy life. An atmosphere of brotherhood, mutual support, and warm human relationships reigned in the garden. Epicurus lived a long life and died in the 270th year BCE at the age of 72 from a painful kidney disease. But even in his last days, when the pain was unbearable, he maintained peace of mind and wrote letters to friends, full of gratitude for the life he had lived. When this doctrine reached Rome, the Romans reacted to it ambiguously. On the one hand, the common sense of Epicureanism was appealing. The teaching was practical, understandable, and did not demand strict asceticism like Stoicism. It promised happiness and pointed to a simple path towards it. But on the other hand, Epicureanism contradicted the very foundations of the Roman system of values. A Roman had to serve the state, participate in public life, and strive for fame and honors. But the Epicureans said, live unnoticed, withdraw from politics. A Roman had to honor the gods of his fathers, offer sacrifices, and participate in religious rites. But the Epicureans taught that the gods are indifferent to humans. Roman conservatives saw Epicureanism as a threat to the traditional way of life. The great Cicero, who was himself a philosopher and wrote much about different doctrines, criticized the Epicureans for their anti-sociality. He said that if everyone lived according to Epicurus, the state would collapse because no one would want to defend it. No one would want to hold office or bear the burden of power. And yet, Epicureanism found its followers in Rome, because despite all its incompatibility with the Roman spirit, this doctrine offered something very valuable. It granted the right to personal happiness, to simple human joy. And in the 1st century BCE, a man appeared who created the greatest monument of Roman Epicureanism. His name was Titus Lucretius Carus, and we know almost nothing about his life, only that he wrote a poem. This poem is called On the Nature of Things, and it is set in verse in the Latin language. More than 6,000 lines of philosophical thought clothed in the most beautiful poetic form. Lucretius took the doctrine of Epicurus and transformed it into a work of art. He describes atoms, their movement in the void, the formation of worlds. He explains all natural phenomena, thunder, lightning, earthquakes, without recourse to the gods, purely materialistically. He passionately persuades the reader to free oneself from the fear of death and the fear of the gods. He paints a picture of a calm, wise life, free from hustle and anxiety. Lucretius's poem is a hymn to reason, nature, and freedom of spirit. And when, 1,500 years later, during the Renaissance, people rediscovered this text, it had the effect of a bombshell, because Lucretius spoke about what the Church forbade thinking about: the materiality of the world, the mortality of the soul, the randomness of all existence. Epicureanism never became a mass doctrine in Rome, like Stoicism. It remained a philosophy for the few, for those who sought not fame and service, but quiet happiness away from the main road. But precisely because of this, it bestowed something very valuable, a reminder that life can be simple and joyful, that happiness requires neither wealth nor power, that bread, water, and a good friend nearby are enough. If it were necessary to choose one person who embodied the entire spirit of Roman philosophical thought, that person would be Marcus Tullius Cicero. He was neither the deepest thinker nor the most original philosopher, but he was the one who gave the Romans the language of philosophy, who taught them to think philosophically in their native Latin tongue. Cicero was born on the 3rd of January, 106 BCE. in the small town of Arpinum, about 100 kilometers from Rome. His family belonged to the equestrian order. This was the Roman upper middle class, wealthy people but not aristocrats by blood, not the patrician families that had ruled Rome for centuries. Cicero's father was an educated man, loved books, and valued scholarship, and he understood that for a son from the province, the only path upward was through education and talent. The boy was brought to Rome as a child, and here his path to knowledge began. Cicero studied with the best teachers of the time, Roman and Greek. He studied law, rhetoric, and philosophy. He attended the lectures of Stoics, academic skeptics, and Epicureans. He read Plato, Aristotle, and Zeno, and all this richness of Greek thought was absorbed into his young soul, eager for knowledge. But Cicero did not intend to become an armchair philosopher. He wanted something else. He wanted power, fame, and influence. And in Rome, the path to this lay through oratory. And here, nature gifted the young man generously. He had an incredible gift of speech, the ability to persuade, and the capacity to find precise, poignant formulations. At 25 years old, he delivered his first significant judicial speech defending Publius Quinctius in a property dispute. Then came an even bolder speech, the defense of Sextus Roscius, who was accused of parricide, and behind this accusation were the people of the dictator Sulla, the de facto master of Rome. The young lawyer won the case, but drew danger upon himself, and Cicero prudently left, formally to continue his education, but in reality to let the wrath of powerful enemies cool down. He spent 2 years in Greece, in Athens and Rhodes, attending lectures by philosophers and rhetoricians, and this time became for him the period of his true philosophical education. He did not merely study different doctrines, he tried to understand how they related to each other, what they had in common, what was different, and what was true. After Sulla's death, Cicero returned to Rome and began his ascent up the ladder of Roman offices. Quaestor, aedile, praetor, and finally, in the 63rd year BCE, the pinnacle of his career, the consulship, the highest magistracy of the Republic. And Cicero was the first new man in many decades, one who did not originate from the aristocracy, to achieve this height. It was during the year of his consulship that an event occurred that made Cicero famous forever, and simultaneously became the beginning of his future troubles. A man named Lucius Sergius Catilina, a bankrupt aristocrat who had lost the consular election, organized a conspiracy. He wanted to seize power by force, burn Rome, and kill the senators. Cicero uncovered the conspiracy, delivered his famous speeches against Catiline, "How long, O Catiline, will you abuse our patience?" and secured the execution of the conspirators. He was proclaimed the savior of the country, the father of the homeland. It was a triumph. But the triumph was short-lived. Cicero's enemies accused him of executing Roman citizens without trial, and in the 58th year they achieved his exile. Cicero spent 1.5 years in exile in Greece, the most bitter time of his life. He, who was accustomed to being at the center of events, was cut off from everything he loved. But he was brought back, and Rome met him with jubilation. However, the political situation had changed. The era of military dictators was approaching. Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, then Mark Antony. The Republic, which Cicero loved so much, was dying, and gradually he realized that his time had passed, that there was no longer a place for him on the political stage. And then Cicero turned to what he had always loved, but had not previously had time for: philosophy. In the last years of his life, especially after Caesar's assassination in the 44th year, when Cicero briefly returned to major politics and then withdrew again, he wrote an incredible number of philosophical treatises on the state, on laws, on the nature of the gods, on fate, on the ends of good and evil, Tusculan disputations, on duties, on friendship, on old age. An entire library of philosophical works flowed from his pen in just 3 or 4 years. It was a miracle of productivity. And here, the greatest merit of Cicero before European culture manifested itself. He created Latin philosophical terminology. Before him, philosophical concepts existed only in Greek. But he found or invented Latin words for all these concepts: qualitas, quality; quantitas, quantity; substantia, substance; accidentia, accident; definitio, definition; individuum, individual; moralis, moral; intellectus, intellect, and dozens of others. Thanks to Cicero, philosophy began to speak Latin, and through Latin, all these terms entered modern European languages. Cicero did not create his own philosophical system. He was an eclectic. He took what seemed right to him from various doctrines. From the Stoics, he took ethics, the doctrine of duty, of virtue as the highest good. From the Platonists and academics, the conception of truth and how difficult it is to attain. From Aristotle, logic and a practical approach to political questions. The Romans did not need abstract philosophical arguments. They needed answers to concrete questions. How to live rightly? What is justice? How to structure the state? What laws are needed? Cicero answered these questions, drawing on all the richness of the Greek philosophical tradition, but presenting it in a way that was understandable and applicable to Roman life. Let us take his treatise On Duties, the last thing he wrote, addressed to his son, Marcus, who was then studying in Athens. This book became a standard for European intellectuals for centuries. It was read in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and in the modern age. It was quoted by church fathers and Enlightenment thinkers, kings and republicans. In this treatise, Cicero speaks of the four main virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. He reflects on how the morally right and the practically useful relate to each other. He teaches how to act in difficult situations when duty contradicts personal benefit. And his answer is always the same. Honesty is more important than benefit. Justice is more important than success. Virtue is more important than wealth. Cicero believed in philosophy not as an idle diversion for leisure, but as a vital necessity. Philosophy is the teacher of life, he wrote. It teaches how to live. It prepares for death. It gives strength to endure misfortunes. It moderates joys so they do not turn the head, and it comforts in grief. In political philosophy, Cicero was a proponent of a mixed constitution, one that combines elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. He believed this was the most stable form of government because different principles are balanced within it, and no one can usurp all power. The Roman Republic in its best times seemed close to this ideal to him. Consuls as the monarchical element, the Senate as the aristocratic, and the popular assemblies as the democratic. But the main thing Cicero taught was the existence of natural law, a law that is superior to any human establishments. There are laws of nature, there are laws of reason, and they are uniform for all people, for all nations, for all times. The true law is right reason corresponding to nature. It is eternal and unchangeable. It calls for good and deters from evil, and no Senate, no people can abolish this law. This idea was revolutionary. It meant that there was a criterion by which human laws could be judged. An unjust law is not law. A power that violates natural law is not legitimate power. Cicero believed in man. He believed that man is a rational, free being capable of distinguishing good from evil and choosing good. Man bears moral responsibility for his actions because he is free. And this freedom is the greatest gift and the greatest burden simultaneously. But Cicero's time was ending. After Caesar's assassination in the 44th year BCE, a new civil war began. Cicero supported the young Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, against Mark Antony. He delivered 14 angry speeches against Antony, calling them Philippics, in honor of the famous speeches of the Greek orator Demosthenes against Philip, the Macedonian king. But politics does not forgive nobility. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus concluded an alliance, the Second Triumvirate, and compiled proscription lists, lists of those who must be killed and their property confiscated. And Octavian, although Cicero was his ally, agreed to hand the philosopher over to Antony for slaughter. Perhaps this was the price of the alliance, Perhaps Octavian understood that the old Republican Cicero would never accept the new order, the monarchy he intended to establish. On the 7th of December, 43 BCE, the assassins caught up with Cicero on the road near his villa in Formiae. He was 63 years old. He could have fled, but he did not. He ordered his bearers to stop the litter and, according to legend, said, "I will go no further. Let an unhappy life end in misfortunes." He leaned his head out of the litter and offered his neck to the sword. The centurion cut off his head and hands, the very hands with which he wrote the Philippics. Antony ordered Cicero's head and hands to be displayed in the forum on the rostra, the orator's platform from which he had so often spoken. This was revenge and a warning. Antony's wife, it is said, pierced the tongue of the dead orator with a needle, the tongue that so often scourged her husband. Thus died Cicero, politician, orator, philosopher. He remained faithful to the Republic until the end, and the Republic perished with him. Octavian became Emperor Augustus, and a new century began, the century of the Empire, a century when the freedom of speech that Cicero valued so highly became a dangerous luxury. But Cicero's books outlived the empire. They were read for centuries. The Christian Church Fathers, Blessed Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, admired his moral teaching and found in it an anticipation of Christian ethics. In the Middle Ages, Cicero was read in monasteries. In the Renaissance, humanists rediscovered his letters and treatises and saw in him the model of a citizen man uniting thought and action. Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century drew from him ideas about natural law and republican freedom. Cicero gave Europe not only philosophical ideas, he gave the language in which these ideas could be expressed. He showed that philosophy is not the preserve of a narrow circle of initiates, but a universal heritage, that the deepest things can be spoken of clearly and beautifully. He was a bridge between Greece and Rome, between antiquity and the Middle Ages, between the ancient world and us. We have spoken of philosophers, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Cicero. We have spoken of how they reflected on virtue, justice, and the right life. But all these reflections might have remained merely beautiful words if the Romans had not done something unique. They transformed philosophy into active law. Roman law is not just a collection of statutes. It is philosophy brought to life, crystallized in legal formulas, working every day in courts and offices throughout the vast empire. And to understand how unusual this was, one must imagine how this astonishing phenomenon arose in the first place. In early times, when Rome was still a small city-state, the law was simple and severe. The laws of the 12 tables, carved on bronze plaques in the 5th century BCE, regulated the most basic things: property, inheritance, family, crimes. These were rules born of practice, tradition, and custom. No philosophy, no abstract principles, only concrete directives for concrete cases. But then, in the 2nd century BCE, Greek philosophy came to Rome, and everything changed. Young Romans from noble families who studied philosophy later became jurists, judges, and praetors, and they carried with them the baggage of ideas they had received from Greek teachers. Stoics had a particularly strong influence. It was from them that Roman jurists adopted the idea that became the cornerstone of Roman legal consciousness, the idea of natural law. What is natural law? It is law that exists not because someone invented or recorded it, but because it flows from the very nature of things. The Stoics taught that the entire world is governed by a rational law, the logos, and this law is uniform for all, for gods and men, for Greeks and barbarians, for free men and slaves. This is a law written not on tables or in books, but in nature itself, in human reason. Roman jurists took up this idea and developed it. They began to distinguish three types of law. The first is natural law, that which is common to all living beings. For example, the impulse to preserve one's life, continue the species, and protect offspring. These are natural laws that both humans and animals obey. The second is the law of nations, ius gentium, that which is common to all people, regardless of which nation they belong to. Trade, the observance of treaties, respect for ambassadors. These are norms recognized by all civilized nations. And the third is civil law, ius civile, that is, the laws of a specific state, in this case, Rome. And this is what was important. Natural law stood above human establishments. If any law contradicted natural law, it was not considered just. An unjust law is not law. This thought sounds revolutionary even today, and 2,000 years ago, it was truly groundbreaking. One of the greatest Roman jurists, a man named Celsus the Younger, who lived at the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era, gave a definition of law that became famous for ages. He said, "Law is the art of the good and the equitable." Not science, not a craft, but an art. Because a jurist must not simply know the paragraphs of the laws, he must feel justice, understand what is right and what is not. The concept of justice, equitas in Latin, lay at the heart of Roman legal consciousness. Justice was the guiding star upon which Roman jurists oriented themselves. Formal law could be cruel. It might not take into account all the circumstances of a specific case, and then the jurist's task was to find a just solution, even if it did not perfectly fit the letter of the law. Interestingly, Roman law was very practical, very utilitarian. Romans said, "Utility is the mother of the good and the equitable." This did not mean they were soulless pragmatists. It meant that a good law is a law that benefits society, that promotes peace, order, and the well-being of the people. Throughout the centuries, great jurists worked in Rome who were simultaneously philosophers. At the beginning of the 3rd century of our era, their works reached their peak. 5 names shine especially brightly: Papinian, Ulpian, Paul, Gaius, and Modestinus. Papinian was considered the deepest thinker among them. It was said that his judgments were distinguished by such clarity and rigor that it was impossible to say it better. He was not merely a connoisseur of laws, he was a sage who understood the very essence of law. Papinian served under Emperor Septimius Severus, and then under his son Caracalla. And when Caracalla killed his brother and co-ruler Geta, he demanded that Papinian write a justification speech. The old jurist refused. He said, "It is easier to commit fratricide than to justify it." He was executed for these words, but his memory remained as a man for whom justice was above life. Ulpian was born in Syria, but became one of the pillars of Roman jurisprudence. He wrote a huge number of works, commentaries on Praetorian law, on civil law, textbooks. It was Ulpian who clearly formulated the division of law into natural, the law of nations, and civil. He was a passionate proponent of Stoic philosophy, and this is evident in his views. For example, concerning slavery, he wrote, "By natural law, all are born free. Slavery is a human establishment, contradicting nature." He could not abolish slavery. It was the foundation of Roman society, but he pointed out its injustice from the perspective of the higher law. Paul and Gaius were equally significant figures. Their writings are a treasury of Roman legal thought, a combination of practical experience and philosophical depth. Roman law was casuistic, meaning it was built on the analysis of specific cases. Roman jurists did not like abstract general rules. They preferred to take a concrete life situation and decide how to act justly in that particular case. And then, by accumulating such decisions, they gradually deduced general principles. This was a very flexible, living method. The law did not crystallize into dead paragraphs. It grew, developed, and adapted to changing life. And yet, it remained faithful to the deep philosophical foundations that were laid by the Stoics. The idea of justice, the idea of natural law, the idea of human dignity. But difficult times were coming. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries of our era. This was the era of the empire's crisis. Barbarians breached the borders, provinces fell away, emperors succeeded one another in bloody coups. The old culture was dying, old knowledge was being lost. And so, in the 6th century, when the Western Roman Empire had already fallen and the Byzantine Empire ruled in the East, Emperor Justinian decided to do what could save the Roman legal heritage for future generations, to collect and systematize all Roman law. In the 528th year, Justinian created a commission of 10 outstanding jurists led by a man named Tribonian. Their task was monumental: to review thousands of volumes written by Roman jurists over centuries, select the most important parts, systematize them, eliminate contradictions, and create a coherent body of law. The work proceeded at incredible speed. Just 1 year later, in the 529th year, the Codex was ready, a collection of imperial decrees. Then the commission undertook an even more complex task: the creation of the digesta, which were excerpts from the writings of classical jurists. They worked through the works of Papinian, Ulpian, Paul, Gaius, and dozens of other jurists, selected the most important fragments, and arranged them by topic. This work was completed in the 533rd year. Simultaneously, the institutiones, were written, a law textbook for students, in which the fundamentals were presented in a simple and clear form, and all subsequent decrees by Justinian himself constituted the 4th part, the novels, novellae. This entire enormous work was called the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, and it was truly a compilation of all Roman legal genius, accumulated over centuries. The Byzantine Empire lasted for almost 1,000 more years, and throughout this entire period, Justinian's laws were the basis of its legal system. But even more important is what happened later, in the Middle Ages. In the 11th and 12th centuries in Western Europe, which was then just emerging from the dark ages of the early Middle Ages, Roman law was rediscovered. In Italian universities, especially Bologna, scholars began to study Justinian's digests, and this was like a revelation. People saw that a coherent, logical, profound system of law existed based on reason and justice. The so-called reception of Roman law began, its assimilation by European countries. The national legal systems of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands were created based on Roman law. Even in Russia, Justinian's code was studied. Thus arose the Romano-Germanic legal family, one of the 2 great legal traditions of the modern world. And at its core lies what the Romans created 2,000 years ago: a synthesis of practical wisdom and philosophical principles, concrete common sense, and high ideals of justice. Roman law lives on to this day. When a modern judge seeks a just solution, when a lawyer interprets the law, trying to find its spirit and not just the letter, when we speak of human rights, of natural law, of the fact that an unjust law is not law, we continue the tradition begun by Roman jurist philosophers. Philosophy ceased to be an abstract contemplation. It became a working tool, regulating the lives of millions of people. This is the greatest achievement of the Roman genius. We have spoken of Stoicism and Epicureanism, the two great philosophical currents that defined the spiritual life of Rome. But the intellectual landscape of antiquity was much richer and more diverse. There were other doctrines, other voices in the great chorus of philosophical thought, and, although they did not become as influential in Rome, they added their important nuances to the overall picture. One such current was skepticism, the philosophy of doubt, which taught not to rush to final judgments. Skepticism came from Greece, and it had two branches: academic skepticism, associated with Plato's Academy, and Pyrrhonism, named after the philosopher Pyrrho. Academic skepticism gained wider currency in Rome. Imagine a school founded by Plato himself in the 4th century BCE at some point abandoned the dogmatic teaching of specific truths and turned into a school of doubt. This happened in the 3rd century BCE, when the scholarch, the head of the school, became a philosopher named Arcesilaus. Academic skeptics taught a simple but astonishing thing: we cannot be sure of anything. Any of our judgments may turn out to be erroneous. What seems obvious to us may actually be an illusion. Senses deceive us. Reason can err. Authorities can be mistaken. But this does not mean that one should abandon thinking and activity altogether. Skeptics proposed a method they called by the Greek word epoche, suspension of judgment. Do not rush to assert that this is true and that is false. Consider all arguments for and against. Weigh the probability, and act based on what seems more plausible, but never consider your knowledge final. Skepticism was primarily directed against the Stoics, who asserted that truth is knowable through correct, clear impressions. Skeptics attacked this certainty, showing that any impression can be doubted, that there is no criterion of truth that does not itself need justification. This intellectual position, the search for truth through doubt, proved very close to the Roman mind, especially the juridical mind. Roman orators and lawyers had to be able to argue both for and against any thesis. And here, the skeptical method proved incredibly useful. Cicero, whom we have already discussed, studied at the Academy precisely during its skeptical phase. And although he was not a pure skeptic, he believed that some things could be known with a sufficient degree of certainty. The skeptic's method deeply influenced him. His philosophical dialogues are structured precisely in this way. He presents different points of view, provides arguments for and against, shows the complexity of the problem, and only then cautiously leans toward a conclusion. Skepticism taught intellectual humility, caution in judgments, and a willingness to reconsider one's views. In a world where dogmatism often led to fanaticism, where people killed each other over different beliefs, this position was very valuable. But there was another pole of antique philosophy, people who doubted nothing, who knew how one should live, and lived exactly that way, provocatively, shockingly, disregarding everyone's opinion. These were the Cynics. Cynicism arose in Greece in the 4th century BCE. Its founder is considered to be Antisthenes, a student of Socrates, but the true embodiment of Cynic philosophy became the legendary Diogenes of Sinope. So many stories circulated about him that it is difficult to separate fact from fiction, but the image of this philosopher became a symbol of radical freedom. Diogenes lived in a huge clay barrel, a pythos, in the public square in Athens. He had no house, almost no possessions, only a staff, a knapsack, and a coarse cloak. During the day, he wandered the city with a lighted lamp, saying, I am looking for a man, meaning that true men could not be found among all these ordinary people. The Cynics preached a return to nature, a rejection of everything artificial, of all the conventions of civilization, wealth, power, fame, even propriety and shame. All these they considered unnecessary layers that prevent a person from being free. Diogenes demonstratively violated all rules of decency. It is said he relieved himself right in the square, explaining, "Animals do this, and they are not ashamed, so why should I be ashamed?" When asked why he lived like a dog, he replied, "That is precisely why I am called a cynic." In Greek, that word means dog-like. But behind this shock value lay a serious philosophical idea. The Cynics taught autarky, self-sufficiency, independence from everything external. The less you need, the freer you are. If you depend on comfort, on people's opinions, on things, you are a slave to all of it. And Diogenes was free. It is said that when pirates captured him and sold him into slavery, he pointed to a wealthy buyer at the slave market and said, "Sell me to this man. He needs a master." Cynicism did not become a mass movement in Rome. The Romans were too social, too connected to the state and society to adopt this radical anti-sociality. But Cynicism deeply influenced Stoicism. The Stoics took much from the Cynics: contempt for external goods, ethical rigor, the idea of inner freedom. Only the Stoics softened the extremes of cynicism, making this philosophy more acceptable for a person living in society. There was also one more doctrine that attracted the Romans with its mystery and mystical charm: Pythagoreanism. Pythagoras, who lived in the 6th century BCE, was a semi-mythical figure, simultaneously a mathematician, philosopher, religious teacher, and founder of a secret brotherhood. The center of Pythagorean teaching is numbers. The Pythagoreans believed that everything in the world is number or can be expressed through number. Musical harmony is a ratio of numbers. The movement of the planets is subject to numerical laws. Even justice, friendship, and health, all of this can be described through numbers. Unity, one, symbolized oneness, indivisibility, the divine beginning. 2, division, multiplicity, matter. 3, harmony, the union of opposites. 4, stability, earthly order. 10 was a sacred number because it contained all the others. But Pythagoreanism was not just a mathematical philosophy, it was a way of life. The Pythagoreans believed in the transmigration of souls, in that after death, the soul could inhabit another body, human or even animal. Therefore, they did not eat meat, so as not to eat someone who had been human in a past life. They adhered to strict discipline, observing many prohibitions and rules. Pythagoreanism was never widespread in Rome, but it attracted mystically inclined people who sought a deeper, more sacred knowledge than what ordinary philosophy offered. Pythagorean ideas about harmony, about the numerical foundations of the world, influenced Roman philosophers and scientists. And here is what is interesting. Roman philosophy was eclectic by nature. The Romans were not creators of original philosophical systems. They took what they liked from various doctrines and combined it together. From the Stoics, they could reflect on natural law in the spirit of the Stoics in the morning, apply the skeptical method in a court proceeding in the afternoon, read Epicurus on friendship in the evening, and none of this seemed like a contradiction to him. He took from each doctrine what was applicable to his specific situation. This practical orientation of Roman philosophy is its main feature. The Greeks created systems. The Romans created life according to these systems. The Greeks argued about truth. The Romans applied truth in action. And precisely because of this, Roman philosophy proved so enduring, so applicable, so relevant throughout the ages. Because in the end, philosophy is needed not to know many words and theories. It is needed to know how to live with dignity, how to make decisions, how to remain human in inhuman circumstances. And the Romans understood this perfectly. The 3rd century of our era, the Roman Empire was plunging into chaos. Emperors succeeded one another, many ruling for only a few months before being killed by their own soldiers. The borders were collapsing under the onslaught of barbarians. Goths were breaking through the Danube. Persians were threatening the eastern provinces. Inside the empire, epidemics raged. The economy was falling apart, and old cities were declining. It was a time of despair, a time when it seemed the whole world was coming to an end. People sought salvation, not political, not military, but spiritual. They wanted to understand what was happening, to find meaning in this chaos, to gain hope for something eternal, something indestructible. And it was precisely in this dark time that the last great philosophical doctrine of antiquity was born, Neoplatonism, a philosophy that called upwards toward the divine light, promising liberation from the burden of the material world. Its creator was born around the 205th year in the Egyptian city of Lycopolis. His name was Plotinus. We know almost nothing about his childhood and youth. He himself did not like to talk about his past. According to the testimony of his student, Plotinus was ashamed of having a body, and even less did he want to talk about his birth and parents. Until the age of 28, Plotinus searched for a teacher who could give him true knowledge. He listened to various philosophers in Alexandria, then one of the greatest cultural centers of the world, a city of libraries, museums, and scholarly schools. But none of the teachers satisfied him, until one day someone advised him to go to a man named Ammonius Saccas. Ammonius was a mysterious figure. He wrote nothing, taught only orally, and required his students to swear an oath not to reveal his teaching. It is said that even the Christian theologian Origen was among his listeners. Plotinus came to Ammonius's lecture, and after the very first conversation exclaimed, "This is the one I was looking for." He stayed with Ammonius for 11 years. In the 242nd year, the young Emperor Gordian III set off on a campaign against the Persians. Plotinus, who was already about 40 years old, joined the army. He was drawn not by war, he was drawn by the desire to reach Persia, and perhaps even India, to become acquainted with the wisdom of the East, about which legends circulated. But the campaign ended in disaster. The emperor was killed, the army retreated, and Plotinus had to flee. He lived in Antioch for 2 years, and then, in the 244th year, he moved to Rome. He founded his philosophical school in Rome. It was an unusual community. Plotinus lived very simply, practically as an ascetic. He hardly slept, ate little, and did not marry. But people of all kinds gathered around him, educated aristocrats, senators, doctors, even women, which was rare for philosophical schools. Plotinus taught only orally for 10 years, like his teacher Ammonius. He conversed with students, answered questions, and held philosophical debates. And only when he turned 50 did he begin to write down his thoughts. Emperor Gallienus, an enlightened ruler among that succession of soldiers and tyrants, favored Plotinus. The philosopher even proposed a grandiose project to him, to found a city of philosophers in Campania, which would be called Platonopolis, and would live according to the laws of Plato's ideal state. Gallienus initially agreed, but then courtiers dissuaded him. They feared this strange project. Platonopolis was never built. Plotinus lived in Rome for 26 years and died in the 270th year at the age of 66 from a severe illness. His notes, fragmentary, often difficult to understand texts, were collected and published by his most devoted student, Porphyry. Porphyry divided the teacher's writings into 6 sections, each containing 9 treatises. Hence the name of the entire collection, the Enneads, which in Greek means nines. 54 texts about the deepest questions of being, the soul, and the ascent to the divine. So, what was the essence of Plotinus's teaching? Plotinus took Plato's philosophy and brought it to its logical conclusion, creating a coherent system that explained everything, from the highest divine first principle to the lowest matter. At the foundation of everything, Plotinus taught, lies the One, that which cannot be described in words because any description already implies multiplicity, and the One is absolutely unified, simple, and perfect. It is above being, above thought, above good. One cannot even say it is, because that is already a separation into subject and predicate. But from the One flows everything else, not because it wants to create, not because it needs something, but simply by the necessity of its nature, just as light flows from the sun. Plotinus called this process by the Greek word emanation, a flowing out, an outpouring. The first thing that flows from the One is the intellect, nous in Greek. The intellect is already something defined. It is the first being, the first thought. The intellect contains all the forms, ideas, the eternal paradigms of things about which Plato spoke. The intellect thinks itself, and through this thought contains all knowledge. From the intellect flows the soul, the third hypostasis. The soul is already turned not only upwards, towards the intellect, but also downwards, towards matter. It creates the sensible world. It vitalizes it. It is present in all things. There is the world soul, which governs the cosmos, and there are individual souls, human souls, which are parts of this world soul. And finally, at the very bottom of this hierarchy lies matter, dark, formless, devoid of any quality. Matter is almost nothing. It is pure potentiality to receive form, but by itself it is empty. And it is the source of evil because it is the opposite of the divine one. It is the maximum distance from the source of light. This was a majestic picture of the universe, a ladder of being leading from the incomprehensible height of the One downwards, through the intellect and the soul, to dark matter. Each step is poorer than the previous one. Each is further from the source, yet everything is sustained by the power flowing from above. But Plotinus's philosophy was not merely a theory about the structure of the world. It was a doctrine of the salvation of the soul. Because the human soul, according to Plotinus, is a tragic being. It came from the divine world. It once contemplated the eternal ideas in the intellect. It was close to the One. But then it descended into matter, clothed itself in a body, and forgot its true origin. And now the soul's task is to return home, to restore the connection with the divine, to purify itself from the material, and to reunite with the One. This is the path of ascent, the reverse of the path of emanation. How to accomplish this ascent? Plotinus proposed an entire program of spiritual perfection. First, one must cleanse oneself of passions, of attachment to the bodily, to pleasures, to wealth, to fame. Practice the virtues, justice, courage, moderation, wisdom. Then second, one must turn to the contemplation of the beautiful. Through earthly beauty, the soul begins to remember heavenly beauty. It awakens from the sleep of matter. Third, study the sciences, especially mathematics, because numbers and geometric forms are closer to eternal ideas than crude material things. And finally, philosophy, the contemplation of the ideas themselves, the ascent of the mind to the intellect. But there is yet a higher stage, ecstasy, going beyond the limits of the mind, a mystical union with the One. This cannot be described in words. It can only be experienced. In the moment of ecstasy, the soul loses the sensation of its separateness. It dissolves in the divine light. It becomes one with the One. Plotinus himself experienced such states. Porphyry wrote that during the 6 years he was with his teacher, the latter achieved ecstatic union with the divine 4 times. This was not just philosophy. It was a religion for intellectuals, a mystical path to salvation, an alternative to Christianity, which was gaining strength in the very same era. After Plotinus's death, his doctrine continued to be developed by students and followers. Porphyry, who published the Enneads, wrote many of his own works, including a fierce attack on Christianity, the treatise Against the Christians, which was later burned by order of the Christian emperors. Iamblichus, in the 4th century, gave Neoplatonism an even more religious, almost magical character. He taught about theurgy, divine action, rituals that could bring the soul closer to the gods. Proclus, in the 5th century, created a grandiose systematization of the entire Neoplatonic doctrine, an incredibly complex, sophisticated construction of hundreds of categories and levels of being. Neoplatonism became the last bastion of pagan philosophy, the last attempt to revive the ancient religion in a new, more spiritual, more philosophical form. Neoplatonists fiercely defended polytheism against Christianity. They argued that the ancient gods were manifestations of the one divine principle, that the old cults held deep mystical meaning. But history turned against them. Christianity won. In the 4th century, the empire officially became Christian. Pagan temples were closed, sacrifices were forbidden, and philosophical schools were subjected to pressure. And here is the paradox. Neoplatonists were the enemies of Christianity, yet their philosophy profoundly influenced Christian theology. Christian thinkers, Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, borrowed Plotinus's ideas and refined them within a Christian context. The doctrine of the Trinity, 3 hypostases of the one God, was formed under the influence of Plotinus's triad of the one intellect soul. The idea of the soul's ascent to God, mystical union with the divine, and contemplation of the eternal light, all this came from Neoplatonism. Blessed Augustine, the greatest of the Latin Church Fathers, wrote directly that the books of the Platonists helped him convert to Christianity, that through Plotinus he first glimpsed spiritual reality. Thus, philosophy, created by a pagan to fight Christianity, became the foundation of Christian theology. This was an astonishing victory-defeat. But for Neoplatonism itself as a pagan philosophy, the end was near. In the 529th year, Emperor Justinian issued an edict closing the philosophical schools in Athens. Plato's academy, which had existed for 9 centuries since its founding, was closed forever. The last Athenian Neoplatonists, 7 philosophers led by Damascus, went into exile in Persia, hoping to find patronage there. But soon they returned, disillusioned and dispersed. Antique philosophy had ended. But its legacy lived on and continued to live in Christian theology, in Arabic philosophy, in Jewish Kabbalah, in European mysticism, and in the philosophy of the Renaissance. Plotinus died, but his ideas proved immortal. 2 worlds met in the Roman Empire of the first centuries of our era, the world of antique philosophy, rooted in the depth of centuries, and the world of a completely new teaching, Christianity, which came from distant Judea and spread rapidly through the cities of the empire. And this meeting was dramatic, full of contradictions, mutual misunderstanding, but ultimately incredibly fruitful. The first Christians viewed Greek philosophy with suspicion and often with open hostility. For them, philosophy was part of the pagan world, a world of idolatry, a world they had left behind when adopting the new faith. The Apostle Paul, the most educated man of his time, who himself knew philosophy, wrote in his epistle to the Corinthians, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate." He said that human wisdom is madness before God, that the Christian preaching of the crucified Christ is foolishness to the Greeks who seek wisdom. And indeed, educated pagans, raised on Plato and Aristotle, often mocked Christianity. It seemed absurd to them to believe in the resurrection of the dead, in the incarnation of God in man, in salvation through suffering and death. Their philosophy taught contempt for the body and matter, seeking liberation from the bodily, while Christians spoke of the resurrection of the flesh. Their philosophy taught that the divine is unchangeable and impassive, while Christians spoke of a God who suffers and dies on the cross. But gradually, during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, another position began to form. Christian thinkers emerged who had received a philosophical education before their conversion and saw no reason to reject everything they had been taught. They began to seek ways to reconcile philosophy and faith, trying to show that antique wisdom could be an ally of Christianity, not its enemy. These people were called apologists, defenders of the faith. They wrote treatises addressed to emperors and educated pagans where they tried to explain Christianity, defend it against accusations, and show its reasonableness. One of the first and most significant was a man named Justin, who lived in the 2nd century. He was called Justin the Philosopher, or Justin Martyr, because he died for his faith, executed in Rome under Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Justin was born into a pagan family, studied various philosophical schools, Platonists, Aristotelians, Pythagoreans, Stoics, seeking truth. And when he converted to Christianity, he did not cast off the cloak of the philosopher. He continued to wear it, continued to consider himself a philosopher, only now a Christian philosopher. Justin taught that truth is one, and that antique philosophers, especially Plato, were close to it because the divine Logos, the Word, that very Christ who later became incarnate, acted in them. Everything true in philosophy leads to Christ. Philosophy was a preparation, a tutor, who led people to the fullness of revelation. In Alexandria, that great center of Hellenistic scholarship, a Christian philosophical school arose. Clement of Alexandria and his even more famous student Origen taught there. Clement was a man of encyclopedic education. He knew Greek literature, philosophy, and mythology, and he believed that all this richness should not be discarded by Christians, but should be reinterpreted and utilized. Origen was a true genius. He was called Adamantius, adamantine or diamond-like, for the incredible sharpness of his mind. He was credited with up to 6,000 writings, a figure that is certainly exaggerated, but it shows the scale of his activity. Origen created Christian philosophy, trying to combine the doctrine of God in the Bible with Plato's ideas about the world of forms, with the Stoics' teaching about the divine Logos. And indeed, Stoicism proved especially close to Christian ethics. Stoics taught self-control, duty, contempt for worldly goods, and readiness for suffering and death. All of this resonated with the Christian doctrine of self-denial, of carrying the cross, of the fact that true life is not in this world. The Stoic concept of the Logos, the divine reason permeating the universe, was used by Christians to understand Christ as the Word of God. But Neoplatonism had an even greater influence. We spoke of Plotinus, who created the doctrine of the soul's ascent to the Divine One through purification, contemplation, and ecstasy. And this philosophy, despite the fact that Plotinus himself and his followers were pagans and often hostile towards Christianity, became a bridge between antiquity and Christian theology. The story of Blessed Augustine is the most vivid example of this. Augustine was born in the 354th year in North Africa, in the city of Thagaste. His mother was a Christian, Saint Monica, but he himself did not adopt Christianity for a long time. In his youth, he was captivated by Manichaeism, a strange dualistic religion that taught about the struggle between light and darkness, spirit and matter. Augustine was a passionate man. He lived with a woman. They had a son. He taught rhetoric, sought a career, and dreamed of fame. But inside, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and the search for something greater grew. And then in Milan, where he came as a rhetoric teacher, Augustine discovered Neoplatonism. He read Plotinus in Latin translation, and it was a revelation for him. Neoplatonism showed him that spiritual reality could exist, that not everything is reduced to matter, that the soul can ascend to the divine. But Neoplatonism could not give him what he needed most, the strength to change his life, to free himself from the passions that tormented him. Plotinus taught ascent through one's own efforts, through philosophical contemplation. But Augustine felt that he could not do it himself, that he needed help from above, he needed grace. And one day, in the garden of his house in Milan, in a state of profound spiritual crisis, Augustine heard a child's voice repeating, "Take up and read, take up and read." He picked up the scripture lying nearby, opened it at random, and read the words of the Apostle Paul about putting on Christ, abandoning the works of the flesh. And at that moment, something broke within him, and he found peace. This was in the 386th year, and soon he was baptized by the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose. Augustine became a Christian, but he remained a philosopher. And in his writings, and there were many, and they were enormous in volume, he combined Neoplatonism with Christianity, creating a synthesis that determined the entire development of Western Christian thought for centuries. He took the Neoplatonic idea of the One, but reinterpreted it as a personal God-creator who does not simply flow into the world by the necessity of his nature, but freely creates the world from nothing, out of love. He took the Neoplatonic idea of the soul's ascent, but added that this ascent is impossible without divine grace, that man cannot save himself by his own strength. He took the Neoplatonic teaching about evil as a lack of being and used it to explain how God, who is absolute good, could have created a world in which there is evil. Evil is not something created by God. It is the absence of good, a distortion, a corruption of what was created good. The Eastern Church also did not stand aside from philosophy. The three great theologians of the 4th century, Basil the Great, Gregory the Theologian, and Gregory of Nyssa, who are called the Cappadocian Fathers, received brilliant philosophical education. And when the Church formulated its dogmas about the Trinity, about the nature of Christ, it used philosophical terms: hypostasis, essence, nature, person. Without philosophical tools, it would have been impossible to precisely express the subtleties of Christian doctrine. In the 5th and 6th centuries, a mysterious author appeared who wrote under the name of Dionysius, the Areopagite, the Athenian who, according to tradition, was converted by the Apostle Paul. In reality, this was an unknown Christian thinker who lived much later. He is called Pseudo-Dionysius. He created a system of Christian Neoplatonism, a doctrine of celestial hierarchy, of the ascent to God through purification, illumination, and union, of the fact that God is unknowable and inexpressible, and he can only be known through the negation of all definitions. Pseudo-Dionysius's writings had a huge influence on medieval mysticism and theology, and at the very end of antiquity, when the empire was already falling apart, when barbarians were ravaging Italy, lived a man who would later be called the last Roman and the first scholastic, Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius. Boethius was born around the 480th year into a most noble Roman family. He received a magnificent education, studied Greek language and philosophy, a rarity for that time when knowledge of Greek had almost disappeared in the West. Boethius set himself a monumental task: to translate all the writings of Plato and Aristotle into Latin, and to show that these two philosophers, who were considered opposites, actually taught the same things. He did not manage to complete this program. Boethius served the king of the Ostrogoths, Theodoric, who ruled Italy after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. For 20 years, Boethius was a loyal advisor to the king, holding the highest posts. But in the 523rd year, he was accused of treason, of a conspiracy in favor of Byzantium. The accusation was false, but Theodoric believed the informers. Boethius was thrown into prison, and 2 years later, in the 525th year, executed. And it was in prison, awaiting execution, that Boethius wrote his famous book, The Consolation of Philosophy. It is a dialogue between the author, plunged into despair, and philosophy, who appears to him in the image of a beautiful woman and comforts him, reminding him of true values. The book is written in the traditions of Stoicism and Neoplatonism, about the variability of fortune, about the fact that external goods are unimportant, that true happiness lies in virtue and the contemplation of the divine. It is surprising that this book contains almost no Christianity. Boethius finds consolation in philosophy, not in faith. But medieval Christians read it as a Christian work, and it became one of the most beloved books of the Middle Ages. Boethius managed to translate the logical writings of Aristotle and Porphyry, and write textbooks on arithmetic, geometry, and music. And these translations and textbooks were the only window into antique philosophy for Western Europe for almost 500 years, until the 12th century, when the rest of Aristotle's works began to be translated. Boethius died, and with him, antique philosophy died in the Latin West. 4 years later, in the 529th year, Emperor Justinian closed Plato's academy in Athens. The last Neoplatonist philosophers went into exile. The era had ended, but it did not end without a trace. Philosophy did not die. It continued to live in Christian theology, in monastic libraries, in the works of theologians and mystics. It was transmitted to the Arabs, who, in the 8th and 10th centuries, translated Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus into Arabic. And then, through the Arabs, it returned to Europe and gave rise to the flourishing of scholasticism. Philosophy and Christianity, which initially seemed irreconcilable enemies, united in a living creative synthesis. And this synthesis defined the face of European culture for centuries. We have traveled a long road from the moment when Roman legions first entered the Greek cities and encountered the world of philosophy, to the last days of antiquity, when philosophical schools were closing and a new era was beginning. 7 centuries, from the middle of the 2nd century BC to the 6th century of our era, philosophy was the living, pulsating heart of Roman civilization. And now, at the end of our journey, it is time to pause and look back to understand, what was it? What did philosophy mean to Rome? And what does it mean to us? living 2,000 years later. Roman philosophy was unique, unlike the Greek philosophy from which it grew. The Greeks created philosophical systems for the sake of knowledge itself. They debated the nature of being, the first principles of the world, the essence of things. This was philosophy as a search for truth, as an intellectual adventure. The Romans approached philosophy quite differently. They were practical people, builders and statesmen. They were not interested in abstract questions for the sake of the questions themselves. They asked, how will this help me live? How will this make me better? How will this serve the state? And from all the richness of Greek thought, they took what worked, what could be applied in life. This was not a simplification or an impoverishment of philosophy. It was its transformation, its conversion from theory into practice. The Romans showed that philosophy is not an amusement for leisurely intellectuals, but a necessary guide for every person who wants to live life with dignity. And philosophy truly shaped Rome on all levels, from the personal life of the individual to the structure of the entire empire. It lay at the foundation of Roman law, that greatest achievement of Roman genius. Every legal norm, every principle of justice, every concept of natural law, all of this grew out of philosophical ideas, primarily Stoic ones. Philosophy defined the political thought of the Romans. Cicero, reflecting on the ideal state structure, relied on Plato and Aristotle. The Roman concept of a mixed constitution, of the balance of powers, of the natural rights of citizens. All these are the fruits of philosophical contemplation. Philosophy permeated military ethics. A Roman soldier had to be not merely brave, he had to possess virtue in the Stoic sense of the word, courage, discipline, readiness for sacrifice, fulfillment of duty regardless of personal desires. These were Stoic ideals embodied in practice. And even in everyday life, in relationships between people, in the education of children, in the understanding of one's place in the world, the influence of philosophy was felt everywhere. A Roman citizen, even if he did not read philosophical treatises, absorbed philosophical ideas from the speeches of orators, from conversations in the forum, from the very spirit of his culture. And among all the philosophical doctrines known to Rome, one was especially close to the Roman spirit, Stoicism. It can be said that Stoicism was the philosophical expression of what it means to be a Roman. The Stoics taught duty, and the Romans always placed duty to the state above personal well-being. The Stoics taught discipline, self-control, and this was the basis of Roman education. The Stoics taught dignity, the ability to maintain firmness of spirit in any circumstance, and the Romans saw this as the highest virtue. The Stoics taught that virtue is the only true good, that wealth, health, even life, all of this is indifferent from the perspective of happiness. And the Romans, educated on these ideas, were ready to give everything for the homeland, for honor, for faithfulness to their word. And we saw how this philosophy was embodied in specific people. Three great Stoics showed what it means to live by philosophical principles in the most varied circumstances. Seneca, the wealthiest man of his time, the advisor to the emperor, a man who possessed power and influence. He could be accused of hypocrisy, preaching poverty while living in luxury. But Seneca showed that the issue is not external circumstances, but inner freedom. One can possess wealth without being its slave. One can be near power without losing one's soul. And when the time came, Seneca let go of everything without regret and met death with the dignity of a philosopher. Epictetus, a slave, lame, possessing nothing, not even his own name. By all standards of that society, he was a nobody, an object, the property of a master. But Epictetus attained true freedom, freedom of spirit, which no one could take from him. He showed that external position does not define a person, that a slave can be freer than an emperor if he masters himself. Marcus Aurelius, emperor, ruler of the greatest power in the world, a man at the pinnacle of power. And yet, every evening he wrote himself reminders of the transience of all existence, that power is a burden, not a privilege, that tomorrow he would die and all his grandeur would turn to dust. He showed that one can occupy the highest position and still maintain philosophical detachment, fulfilling one's duty without attachment to the fruits of one's deeds. Three people, three completely different destinies, and one philosophy that helped each of them remain human. And Cicero gave philosophy a voice in the Latin language. Before him, philosophy spoke only Greek. Cicero created Latin philosophical terminology, found or invented words for all those concepts that previously existed only in Greek. And thanks to this, philosophy became accessible to the Romans. It began to speak their native tongue. But Cicero did more. He showed that philosophy is not a narrow specialty for professionals, but the common heritage of all educated people. He wrote his treatises not for philosophers, but for a wide range of readers, for statesmen, for jurists, for everyone who wanted to understand how to live rightly. He popularized philosophy, not by simplifying it, but by making it understandable and applicable. Roman law became the practical embodiment of philosophical ideas. The concept of natural law, the idea of justice as the foundation of all laws, the notion of human dignity, all this is philosophy crystallized in legal formulas. And these formulas worked for centuries, regulating the lives of millions of people, creating order in chaos. And when Roman law was rediscovered 1,500 years later in medieval Europe, it became the foundation of the modern legal system. We still live by principles that were formulated by Roman jurist philosophers. Neoplatonism was the last word of antique philosophy, the last attempt to create a comprehensive system explaining everything, from the divine first principle to the material world. And although Neoplatonism as a pagan philosophy died with antiquity, its ideas continued to live in Christian theology. Christianity and philosophy initially seemed irreconcilable enemies, but gradually a synthesis occurred that defined the face of European civilization. Christian theologians used philosophical tools to formulate their dogmas. Christian ethics absorbed Stoic ideas about duty and self-control. Christian mysticism borrowed the Neoplatonic doctrine of the soul's ascent to God. Blessed Augustine, the greatest of the Latin Church Fathers, wrote directly that the books of the Platonists helped him convert to Christianity. Thus, antique philosophy entered Christianity and, through it, into European culture. The Roman Empire fell. In the 476th year, the last Western emperor was overthrown. Rome was plundered by barbarians. Great cities turned into ruins. It seemed everything was over, that antique civilization had vanished forever. But philosophy did not die. It continued to live in monastic libraries, where monks copied ancient texts. It lived in the works of Christian theologians. It passed to the Arabs, who translated Aristotle and Plato and preserved them for future generations. And then, in the 12th and 13th centuries, when these translations returned to Europe, a new birth of philosophy began. Stoic ideas about natural law inspired the thinkers of the Enlightenment. Cicero was read by the founding fathers of the American Republic. Marcus Aurelius was studied by European monarchs. Seneca was quoted by moralists of all ages. And today, in the 21st century, Roman philosophy is again in demand. Stoicism is experiencing a true revival. People are rediscovering the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the letters of Seneca, and the discourses of Epictetus, and finding answers to the questions of modern life in them. How to maintain peace of mind in a world full of stress and anxiety. How not to lose oneself in the pursuit of success and money. How to accept what is impossible to change and change what is within our power. How to face the inevitable, illness, old age, death, with dignity. Roman philosophers provided answers to all these questions 2,000 years ago, and these answers have not become obsolete. The lessons of Roman philosophy are simple yet profound. Do not chase what is not in your power. Value time. It is the only true wealth. Fulfill your duty without expecting reward. Be grateful for what you have. Remember death, not to fall into gloom, but to live more fully. Treat others with kindness and justice. Work on yourself every day, and know that virtue is the only thing that has true value. Philosophy does not die with empires. Empires crumble, cities turn to dust, languages are forgotten, but ideas live on. They pass from generation to generation, from culture to culture, finding new forms but preserving their essence. We are the heirs of this tradition, which runs from Greece through Rome to us. Plato and Aristotle, Zeno and Epicurus, Cicero and Seneca, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, Plotinus and Augustine, all of them speak to us across the centuries. Their voices resonate in our thoughts. Their ideas live in our deeds. Roman philosophy taught us that wisdom is not about knowing many facts, but about knowing how to live rightly. That greatness is not in ruling over others, but in mastering oneself. That true freedom is within us, and no one can take it away. That human dignity lies in reason and virtue, not in wealth or origin. And as long as there are people who ask themselves the eternal questions about the meaning of life, about good and evil, about justice and duty, about how to live and how to die, philosophy will live. It will live not just in books, not in university lecture halls, but in the thoughts and deeds of people who try to become better, live more worthily, and leave the world a little brighter than it was. This is true immortality, not personal immortality, not of your name or body, but the immortality of the ideas you carried in this world. Roman philosophy is immortal in exactly this way.